is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
This week marked the adoption of the Global Compact for Migration, where world leaders agreed to chart a path forward for the safe, orderly, and regular migration of people across borders. Taking place at the Intergovernmental Conference on Migration in Marrakesh, Morocco, global leaders highlighted the need for a comprehensive and united approach in addressing the numerous challenges facing migration today. But coming at a time when multilateral approaches are facing mounting opposition, will the principle of shared responsibility for the Global Compact hold? And what are the implications of the Global Compact on migration for the African continent, which is home to countries of origin, transit, and destination for migrants today? I am Liu Feifei from Marrakesh, Morocco. Welcome to this special edition of Talk Africa. It is estimated that there are more than 258 million migrants across the world today. And this number is projected to increase in the years to come due to a number of factors, such as the labor movement and climate change, just to name a few. In order to manage this mass movement of people, more than 160 countries have gathered here in Marrakesh, Morocco to adopt the Global Compact for the safe, orderly, and regular migration. And on the sidelines of this conference, we got an opportunity to sit down with Leonard Doyle, who's a spokesperson for the International Organization on Migration, to get his perspective on this ongoing debate. Let's take a look. Leonard, thank you so much for joining us on this special edition of Talk Africa. Now we're here talking about human migration. One of the themes that I've seen here in Marrakesh is the desire on the part of the organizers, the IOM, to change the narrative on migration, to explain why migration is inevitable, as you mentioned, for some of those underlying factors, including climate change. It's inevitable, it's necessary, because some of the host countries will face a number of development issues, which we'll delve into later. And in changing that narrative, though, the current climate is one, as you described, that migration has a bad reputation. People are fearful of migration. What do you think is driving that fear?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Feifei, for having me here. It's really a pleasure and an honor. Maybe they think they're fearful of migration, but maybe in fact it's something else. Maybe they're fearful of change. Maybe they're fearful for the future, but they might be fearful for their children. And everybody's concerned about employment wherever you are in the world. One day, this might be a robot. You could be.
Indeed, right? They have robot anchors now.
There you
go.
Do. So we should be rightly concerned for our future. So imagine you're a factory worker. You're really worried about your future, because those people who are fulfilling orders that we all like to click and order what we want on whatever the online platform is, that's done in warehouses now by people. Maybe those people will be replaced by robots. In fact, they already are being replaced by robots. So people are very, very anxious. And when people are anxious, they tend to turn on each other and they look for scapegoats. And the scapegoat is quite easily the other, the migrant. And this is where, of course, the Greek word xenophobia comes from, fear of the other. Now, whether justified or not, the outcomes of that are often quite tragic, as we've seen in the continent of Africa not too long ago. When people get it into their head that the other is the problem, whereas it might in fact be the robot, you can have really sad outcomes.
It's hard to please everyone. Certainly there are the people in Europe and a lot of the other host countries who are contesting the Global Compact and how it's going to adversely harm their countries and their economies. But within some of the originating countries as well, such as countries in Africa, there is the perception that perhaps the UN Global Compact for Migration is dominated by the EU, and it's being driven by a desire to stymie the flow of migrants into Europe. How would you respond to that?
Well, let's first of all correct the impression, if I've given it, that migration is a developing country to developed country phenomenon. It's not. It's actually south-south, as they call it. There are more migrants traveling between African countries than there are migrants traveling north. Far more far more.
But the perception is not as
The
such in the
perception
public.
is different, but the facts are there. So we need to try and correct that perception. We need a better factual understanding of the situation. I think that's clear. You are right that European countries are increasingly concerned, and with some good reason, about the stability of their politics. And you just need to open a newspaper, or we don't do that anymore, sorry. Click online or look on the television, and you can see seismic changes in the political landscape in the global north. You can see that. Now, we don't want that to go out of control. Nobody does. Nobody wants to see a drift away from, let's call it, democracy or democratic practices or stable and orderly countries because of a populist concern. So clearly there are concerns that the perception is that it's out of control needs to be put back in the box. A lot of effort has gone into saving lives of people who are traveling across the Mediterranean. Now you can look at that in two ways. Are they simply cynically trying to reduce the flow? Maybe. Or are they trying to save the lives of those people? Maybe both. I would argue both. Because you have to have managed borders, and you cannot have a global situation in which people are dying in awful, awful circumstances. Why are they dying? Because they've been fooled and they've been tricked and they've been abused. So those people have rights, and we surely have a global obligation to help them avoid the choices that they're making. And that's one of the things we're doing in IOM. We're working with those who are being in detention in Libya, and as they return home voluntarily, we help them, we give them some training on a smartphone, and we encourage them to interview each other and to speak of their experience so that their own peer groups can be better informed and can make good judgments about the journey that they're thinking about.
Of the 258 million migrants around the world today, it's estimated that 68 million are refugees. They're driven to flee from their homes because of war and violence and natural disasters, to name just a few of the factors. I caught up with Mr. Filippo Grandi, the UN's High Commissioner for Refugees, to get an outline of the refugee situation today. Commissioner Grandi, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. Now, there were two parallel frameworks that flowed out of the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants. One is this Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, and the other one is the Global Compact on Refugees. Can you tell us a little bit about why the separation, that distinction, is necessary now?
Because people move for different reasons. And many people, the migrants, move to seek better opportunities, but also because of other factors, and but which are climatic, economic, social factors. Refugees are a very special group of people on the move. They flee from violence, war, conflict, persecution, discrimination. So they are a very special group, because you understand very well, if you are a refugee that has escaped from one of these situations, you cannot be sent back. This is a fundamental principle. This is why my organization, UNHCR, was created, to help protect and support and find solutions for these people. Hence this important distinction between migrants and refugees, and hence these two tracks that the New York Declaration, as you said, produced, and that are now culminating this month into two global compacts.
The migrant debate, the refugee debate raging in Europe and Germany, France, Italy, and other European countries overshadows the refugee situation here in Africa. Can you shed some light on the situation here?
Absolutely, and I'm so glad you said this, because when you look at the global displacement figures, leave aside the migrants, this is a different issue, but internally displaced, who are people, refugees in their own countries, refugees who have crossed borders, we calculate there's about 68, 69 million. That's a lot. Maybe not in China, but in the rest of the world, this is a big figure. And 85% are either in poor countries or middle income countries, so not in the rich world. So when you hear there's a refugee crisis in Europe, in Australia, in the US. No, the refugee crisis exists, but it is in Africa, it is in the Middle East, it is in South Asia. This is the places where we see this terrible problems of refugees, and also these are the places that have the least resources to address them.
And as you mentioned earlier, High Commissioner, there are already existing conventions like the 1951 Convention on Refugees, and the AU also has its own frameworks on this issue. How will the Global Compact on Refugees, which is set to be adopted on December the 17th, how is it going to dovetail and collaborate with the existing frameworks?
Well, the Compact is not a new convention. It's not a binding instrument. Neither Compact is, by the way, in spite of what we have heard. So it is, the Compact on Refugees is really a set of very practical measures that states are being offered to organize themselves better to respond to refugee crisis. And there is a lot of emphasis in helping host countries, host communities in Africa, in the Middle East, in Asia, in Latin America, that have the least resources. Because, for example, one of the things that the Compact wants to do, and we've already started doing it, is to mobilize longer-term resources, developmental resources for education, for environment, for jobs, not only for refugees, but for the communities hosting them. So if we deploy, if we use all these tools that the Refugee Compact offers, I think that we will also see a stabilization, less pressure for refugees to move on, to use smuggling networks, to do dangerous journeys, which have created so much suffering for them and panic sometimes in the international community.
High Commissioner, a key word you just mentioned is resources. Now we understand your office is operating under a shortfall of resources this year and looking to 2019 with the refugees crisis projected to be escalating. How are you going to meet your budgetary requirements?
My organization, which is the main UN refugee organization, needs about $8 billion a year to function and to serve these millions of refugees. And in the last few years, we have got about half of that money. So we have to prioritize a lot, and we cannot do a lot of the things we would like to do to make life better for refugees and for their host communities. We are, in a few days, launching again an appeal for next year. So I hope the response will be positive. By the way, I hope it will be positive in China too. I have visited China regularly since I've become High Commissioner for Refugees, and the cooperation is growing. There is a lot of interest in China to participate in this global response to refugees, and I hope that this will continue. But I also hope that through the Global Compact on Refugees, to be adopted at the General Assembly, we'll be able to mobilize different resources, not necessarily through UNHCR, for education, for jobs, as we mentioned. And so we have multiple new opportunities. Let's work together to grab them and improve the management of this complicated problem. I think it is possible.
Indeed. Good luck to you, and thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. It's time for a short break. When we come back, we'll be joined by a panel of experts to talk more about the Global Compact for Migration and its implications for Africa. Stay tuned.
China Global Television Network. From broadcast centers in Beijing, Washington and Nairobi. A unique global perspective. 6 channels and a video content service. News when you want it and where you want it. On TV screens, websites, mobile platforms and social media. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. Joining me now, we have an esteemed panel of experts. We have Professor Walter Kalin, who is the envoy of the chair of the Platform on Disaster Displacement. We are also joined by Mr. Lawrence Igulu, Commissioner of Employment Services at the Ministry of Gender, Labor and Social Development for Uganda. Gentlemen, thank you again for joining Talk Africa. Let's begin by putting this topic of migration into context. It's nothing new. Migration, human migration, has been taking place since the beginning of time. What is the significance of this milestone, the signing of the Global Compact on Migration? Let us start with you, Professor Kalim.
Well, migration always has been a reality, but the context has changed. We have new challenges. For instance, countries that just used to be countries of origin now also have become countries of destination, of transit. We have more and more people compelled to leave because of impacts of climate change, natural disasters, conflict, but they might not qualify as refugees in a legal sense. And then we have, of course, the whole context of globalization. And all of that made it necessary for states to come together and to agree on cooperation. Because what we see way too often, and particularly in Africa, is really unsafe migration. If you're just thinking about all these Africans who perished on the Mediterranean Sea. But it's also a challenge for countries if migration is irregular. And this is really a chance now to come together, to work together, north, south, east, west, to make migration safe and regular. This is what the compact is about.
Commissioner, what are your thoughts about the significance of this milestone?
Thank you very much. I think to me the biggest thing is that globalization is about people, and people are always in search of better well-being, and movement across international boundaries definitely is an aspect of globalization. So having happened over the centuries, over millennia, nothing new, but the new impetus that this compact brings is the strength of multilateralism. It means no one country can do it alone. The search for well-being, the Agenda 2030, which is about human beings, can best be attained if nations come together and handle the challenges that exist. So if people have conflicts, they move. If there is climate change is becoming an issue, people move. But above all, if there are no jobs, people want to move to the next available place where they can be able to earn better well-being for themselves and for their families. So the GCM 23 objectives that are contained therein are part and parcel of implementing an agenda which has been on for millennia, that is migration.
And I do want to talk about those 23 objectives and 10 principles of the GCM. But before that, what are some of the new pull factors that are driving people out of their home countries? Because at the end of the day, no one wants to leave their home, their family, what is familiar to them. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the pull factors?
Well, migration should be a choice, but in all too many situations, it's not really a choice. People are compelled to move because of poverty, because of a lack of a perspective. And this very much has to do with lack of real development that is people-centered. Then we have these new factors like the impact of climate change. If we're just looking at the Horn of Africa, where we have droughts, there always has been droughts, but droughts are coming back more often and more often. We had a huge drought in the Horn of Africa, 2011, 2012, displacing millions of people within their countries, 300,000 victims of famine cross borders into neighboring countries, Kenya, Ethiopia, but even to Uganda. But then only 6 years later, last year, 2017, again a big drought, again displacing people. This time the humanitarian response was better, so people could remain within their own country, but as internally displaced persons, having lost their livelihoods. And then again, what is the perspective?
Commissioner?
Yeah, so this is what I tell young people who come to my office looking for jobs in the country, in Uganda or abroad. I say, there are opportunities available in Uganda. So before you think of moving abroad to look for a job, have you searched around and there is no job? And most of the time they tell me, Commissioner, I've done that and I don't find a job that looks like me. And therefore, let me try my luck elsewhere, whether it's in the Middle East or in China, in Korea, in Australia, in North America, and maybe I'll be able to get something which looks like, you know, the amount of money that my parents put into educating me. So the beginning of this is countries in Africa, countries in other parts of the world need to create jobs at home. Say that their citizens are able to earn a living at home. Say that if they have to move abroad, then it's out of choice. You know, I've exhausted, you know, I've had 5, 10 years of a national job. Now I want an international job. Then I go get it in the Middle East, in North America, or in Europe. So the choice part of it is what I would say should be secondary. So I should move out, not because I've been forced out because of a conflict, or because of religious persecution, or because of climate change, but I should go because I want to offer my skills in another part of the world, and then after a while, probably come back, you know, bring those skills, bring some extra money, invest at home, and give back to society what society gave to me. So so it should be the choice element. I should be able to move out of choice, not because I'm being forced.
And that makes sense, that there should be a safe, orderly, and regular pathways for migration, because while there are the new push factors that you've talked about, climate change and displacement and whatnot, there are also the pull factors where the migrants can fill a need. However, the problem is that now in the world, this issue of migration has created political divisiveness, particularly in Europe. People are in fear of migrants. Can you tell us why that is?
Well, I think there are 3 factors. The first one is that many of the migrants in Europe arrive in irregular ways. So it's not like as a government we can show to our population we are managing these migration movements, these migration flows. Second, many of those arriving are not really prepared for the local labor markets. They are not the kind of people that bring the education that is needed in the local labor markets. And then the third element, and we can see that all over the world, is of course a cultural element. How can we live together in diversity, but still so that we as a host country can keep and safeguard our own identity? And again, all of this calls for regular migration, for managed migration, and not for the irregular kind of migration we see in so many parts of the world, including within Africa, but also from Africa to Europe.
Now, it's interesting to note that while the discussion, the headlines, if you will, about migrants is always focused on migrants from Africa, from the Middle East, heading to Europe, or from Central America into North America. But in fact, a lot of migrants from Africa stay in Africa, as we talked about with some of the migrants in Uganda. Can you tell us a little bit more about just the general perspective of migration on the continent?
I think what I want to say is that, one, the impetus for migration in Africa has actually been hyped given the fact when the African Union adopted Agenda 2063, and now we have the African Union Protocol on Free Movement of Persons, which has also been replicated by, for instance, the IGAD, Intergovernmental Authority on Development. They also have a protocol on free movement of persons. The East African Community has the same. The Economic Commission for West Africa has the same. The Southern African Development Corporation has the same. So that has kind of given the world the feeling that multilateralism, and you can no longer box people in one little nation state. You know, we are now looking at, you know, like East Africa has 6 countries around it. So I should be able to move beyond the 6, my Uganda, and go into any of the other 5 member states of the East African and community. Now we have the free trade area called Africa with its 55 member states. So I should be able to move across to all those countries. So that in itself has, you know, energized the African populace into saying, I'm no longer training my child, I'm no longer sending my child to the University of Cape Town or to Makerere University in Uganda or the University of Nairobi, basically because I'm looking at a little market called Uganda. I'm looking at the African, you know, the East African and then the African market, labor market, in as far as where my child could be employed. So that drive, look, the fact that much as my skill might not be needed in my country, I can go work in Egypt and therefore it will be useful over there. That has definitely opened up to the fact that yes, we are one continent of over 1 billion people, and we can be able to move as far as we want beyond the normal nation states.
But there are problems brought about the free movement of peoples. For example, some of them end up in detention centers under quite atrocious circumstances. What's going to be done through the Global Compact on Migration to address those issues?
As I said, I think the starting point is look at migration as a positive aspect of development. It's been there for millennia, and it will continue to be there. So if you start from that point of view and not look at it as a challenge, as a situation of control, then your mind is open. You open up your mind, and then it becomes much, much more easier to tackle. But the second point that I wanted to bring is the element of international solidarity. I think this is very key. I think that's where we need to understand that the Global Compact allows each one of us to be able to use its citizens for the rest of the world. And that's where we should call for not charity, not generosity, but solidarity. That we are one people, and if one part of the world is in a situation of deprivation, that population could be able to benefit in another part of the world. I'm not saying everybody should open their borders to whom it may concern. It will definitely have to be done in a regulated way, safe, regular, orderly migration, and that's where governments come in. The people who are gathered in the hall behind us, having crafted this 10+23 objectives, they're basically saying there is a win-win situation for all of us in the world, and it must be done by governments, by the UN agency, by NGOs, by the private sector. All of us who are assembled here should be able to come together to ensure that migration is a development aspect of life.
In fact, that is a key theme that we've been exposed to here in Marrakesh, is to change the narrative, to present migration as something that is inevitable, necessary, and beneficial for sustainable development. Having said that, it doesn't mean that the Global Compact, the adoption of it, has been without controversy. Out of the 193 countries that supported it in 2016, 10 of them have pulled out. Can you elaborate? Some of them are key countries, including the United States, Austria, Australia. Can you explain why?
Well, I think there are different factors. One is that this has become a political issue at domestic levels, and has been picked up by those political parties that want to limit migration. The second thing is that it's not really fully understood what the compact is about. There's some lack of trust. Will it be used then to criticize European countries of destination, or will it really be about cooperation? And what is really not understood is this is not just an agreement with words, but it's the beginning of a process. The most important aspect for me in the Global Compact is the follow-up process, because countries will come together every 4 years to discuss these matters. In between there will be the regional meetings to discuss these matters, to take stock of what has been achieved. And it will be a difficult and long process, but at least what we never had, now we have this kind of institutional framework where governments really can come together and work together at bilateral levels, learn from good experiences at regional levels, and also between the different regions.
Gentlemen, thank you both so much for joining us on Talk Africa. And that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. Do remember, we'd love to hear from you, and let's keep this conversation alive online through our social media handles on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Do tune in again next week for more of Talk Africa. From Marrakesh, Morocco, I am Liu Feifei. Thank you and goodbye.